Hello viewers, welcome to Canada Bangladesh Social Justice Action Research Alliance. On this platform, we talk about issues that impact social justice locally and globally. The Alliance consists of a group of academics, activists, artists, writers, poets, and professionals of various backgrounds from around the world who deeply care about protecting and promoting the rights of marginalized groups. We take an active interest in social justice and equity issues. Our goal is to engage in critical conversations that initiate actions to build global solidarity needed for social justice and make the world a more equitable, kind, and compassionate place. Today, I'm extremely excited, to have conversation with Dr. Laura May Lindo. I have been waiting for this conversation eagerly. We will talk about systemic racism in Canada. Incredibly important conversation, and I'm even more, excited because, it's not always possible to have, a conversation that is in academic, but also very, informed activism sort of, conversation. So Dr. Laura Melindo is not only a public representative, she is a very accomplished academic. Dr. Laura Melindo, member of the Provincial Parliament for Kitchener Centre, is a respected activist and educator who holds both a master's and a PhD in education. Her commitment in building inclusive communities, both within and outside educational environments, is grounded in her knowledge of how to put anti-oppression theories into practice. Dr. Laura May is a knowledgeable advocate for the rights of women and girls, a respected ally to marginalized communities and members, and most importantly, a courageous public speaker on issues often left unaddressed in the mainstream. Dr. Laura Melindo is the official opposition critique for anti-racism and citizenship and immigration. The leader of the official opposition appointed her as chair of the official opposition's first Black Caucus to collaborate with Black communities and allies to address systemic anti-Black racism in Ontario. And a lot of our conversation is about, going to be about, building, allyship and to have meaningful conversation. So super excited, and, looking forward to our conversation today. Thank you so much, Dr. May, to make some time for us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
The first question that we ask, and before getting into obviously positionality, that before whoever whatever we do in our life, there must be a personal story that moves us to do what we do. What's your personal story that got you involved in social justice struggle in the context where you are?
So I'm going to answer it in two parts. I often answer things in two parts. I don't know why, but first part is this. When I did my undergrad degrees, I started off at U of T and then ended up moving on to York at one point. But I remember when I was doing my degree at the University of Toronto, I was in philosophy. And as a Black woman in philosophy, there were not a lot of people that looked like me. A lot of the texts are not, they were Western philosophy texts, but they were also positioned as global philosophical texts. And so I would ask a lot of questions and try and figure out what was happening. But I was also young, right? Like you're in university, you're a young person trying to figure out who you are, etc. So I had made a decision that I wanted to be a philosophy professor, and that part of why I wanted to do it is because I was convinced that there were Black folks that had philosophical writings that we should be looking at. So I want to talk about race, and I want to do it within the discipline of philosophy. And so the department head at the time had said to me that he would write a reference letter for me to get into grad school, etc. And the day before the application was due, he hadn't given me the letter. And so I went to his office, and I'm also from, like, my parents are Jamaican, and in that cultural norm, your teachers are like your parents. Like it is not an easy relationship. You do not go over to them and just ask them tomfoolery. It's very respectful, etc. So I was very, very nervous having to go and ask this prof for a reference letter. So I knock on his door, he let me in, and he asked me, why do I want to continue my degree in philosophy? And I explained to him exactly what I said to you. This is what I thought I'd be able to contribute. I had A pluses in his class, so I couldn't understand why there would be a problem. And he said to me, you are not U of T material. You should go to a lesser university like York or McGill. So that threw me into a tailspin. And the reason why I'm starting there is because oftentimes when people of color decide that they want to center their voices, their experiences, the experiences of their communities, that's what the resistance looks like. The mainstream system asks you to second guess your space, right? And whether or not you should be there, your knowledge, your wisdom, your expertise, etc. So that led me to social justice issues because it made me have to confront what I could or couldn't do. And I believed him at first. And so I left the academic world. I was a musician for a number of years, and then my brain started to get weary of not reading and of not being challenged and of not right. And so anyway, I ended up going back to university, got a second undergrad degree, et cetera, et cetera. That led me to wanting to make sure that when I do any of my work, that I center the voices of those that are the most vulnerable or the most marginalized, no matter what I'm studying. So in education, that meant talking about race as part of my degrees, and making sure that that was part of what I wrote about and what I studied, and who I learned from. And so when I jump ahead, before being elected, this is the second part in case you're wondering how long this story will be. But I was elected. Prior to that, I was the director of diversity and equity at Wilfrid Laurier University, so on the admin side of the university. And we had a number of high profile instances on campus of racism. They made it into the media. I was doing interviews and such, which I never thought was going to be part of my job. And I decided to host a summit on the status of race and racism on Canadian university campuses. Also something that I had never done before, but I know that you cannot address racism in a single institution. That the way that racism operates in society requires us all to decide that we're going to do differently and collectively make changes. And when I did that summit, I decided I would also start with the political sphere. So I invited a bunch of local politicians, and only one showed up, Catherine Fife, who's the MPP in Waterloo. And so she participated in the summit, and after it was done, started to call me and ask me if I would consider running for politics. And I said no, and she was persistent. And at one point she said, imagine if you took the work that you're doing now and put it in that broader sphere. And that was the thing that said, okay, then this is what I'm going to do. And so here I am. Sorry for the long story, but I think it's important to understand where people are coming from, because I think that also indicates their commitment, and their understanding of the issues when they start to do this political work.
Yeah, I mean, thank you very much. It was a wonderful answer, and I think, I mean, also I'm an educator. This gives me some, and then this is so. My research, my graduate research in Canada was in the areas of epistemic violence.
Yes.
So I looked into that, how in a country like Bangladesh, which was a former British colony, they, through our education system, how they wanted to create a breed of Indians who are brown in skin but British in mind. So
yes,
that brings me to, actually, I wanted to ask a different question, but this directly segues to this question. When I came to Canada, when I was doing my research, I was studying what's happening in Canada. I wanted to write anti-colonial research, but at a point that when you want to write something, basically, what is the body of knowledge that you borrow from, right? What is the body of knowledge that becomes your literature review, right? So that is very, very critical. Of course, at that time, I was first time as an immigrant. When you come to a country, you're not only navigating academia, you're navigating a cultural land, in social life, all of these things. So it's incredibly connected. Question: this thing about epistemic violence. And I'm going to quote Carter G. Woodson, when our kids don't see their themselves in the books they read, the texts they read, it's very hard for them to be inspired reading about the lives of great white men and women, right? What would you do differently as a public representative, as an academic, as an educator, to promote um, uh, education, social justice education that builds critically conscious, citizens or youth, from the very early in Canada?
That is a fantastic question. So first off, I want us to go backwards a step because that notion of epistemic violence is so important, right? So again, from my philosophy background, I get all excited when I hear any kinds of words that bring me back because then I'm like, ha ha, I did it, right? And so when we think about epistemology and we think about the notion of knowledge, people don't realize that knowledge can be violent. People, they don't take the time to think about that. They don't realize that uh, seeking knowledge can actually be a moment where you are putting your body, your mind, your spirit on the front lines of a war. Because
Mm-hmm.
who controls the knowledge that we're talking about
Mm-hmm.
controls the policies, the practices, the legislation, etc. So the notion of knowledge being neutral or the thing that's going to bring you into a better place has to also be challenged, right? So I love that we're even talking about that. In terms of what we can do in schools to address that, I think historically we talk about representation in schools. So, like you were saying, seeing yourself reflected in the books, etc. Um, but I think that there's two pieces of the puzzle that we often forget. One is back to this notion of the system and the way the system is operating. Our schools are underfunded and have grown accustomed to using the same course books and those text, like the classroom texts, and giving them to kids after kid after kid, right? So you've got 30, a class set of Shakespeare. Shakespeare in the English curriculum is not required, but people do it. It's become customary, but it's not actually written into the curriculum that you must teach Shakespeare. In the English curriculum, it's written in that you should teach different forms of English and different forms of English writing. But
Mm-hmm.
because of funding issues, it's become customary and actually financially viable to buy one course text, one set, and then you just let your kids this year use it, then the kids next year use it, then the kids next year use it until that violence starts. We start to think that it's really the best book in the world. It's the only way to learn about English, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So, because of that, I tell you that to tell you this. I do think that we need to reinvest. We need to think about our investments and prioritize investing in books that reflect the kids and the diversity of our student body. But I also think that in the interim, we need to be honest with ourselves that teacher education doesn't necessarily provide teachers with the tools to take a bad text and still teach in socially just ways. So I've taken whatever text I have access to and still found ways to talk about race, racism, homophobia, sexism. Like I've found ways, classism. You talk about it because of who's missing from the text. But if we don't teach that in teacher college, then those teachers rely on the tools, like the books that you give them, as though they can't teach without them. And it's the reason why now you jump ahead, we're in the midst of a pandemic and people are teaching from home and they're like, I don't have any of my tools. I can't give my kids any. How am I ever going to? The teaching should never be tied to a particular tool in the first place, right? There's a lot of conversations and relationship building that you can do with something that is problematic. And then the very last thing I would say about that is, for me, it always goes back to teachers' college. It always goes back to, because that's where teachers are taught the system of education. And so when we teach them the system of education, are we teaching them to comply with said system? Right? And like I immediately think about Antonio Gramsci, right? Am I teaching them to consent to their own oppression, or am I teaching them that the system needs to shift, and here are some tools to help you shift the system? And I
Yeah.
would hope that people would do that in order for us to get to where we need to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, again, I was born and brought up in a small village, and subsequently came to Canada. I'm giving you a bit of my positionality in order for you to understand that, well, some of the places that I'm coming from. um, you mentioned about Gramsci. One of the things that I really loved about Gramsci in one of my favorite quotes is that our life leaves infinite of traces in our consciousness. As scholars, how do we make sense of those consciousness to make an inventory of this consciousness? Earlier on, very early on in my life, I understood one thing, that if I teach myself English, I can get out of starvation. I can get out of poverty, and that's from a remote village in Bangladesh. But now, when I work in the remote communities in Bangladesh, I tell them that why English language is so powerful. It has
Mm-hmm.
a history behind it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just an ahistorical, right? Speaking about the school system in Canada, particularly if I talk about a school system in Toronto that I have seen myself, is that schools are the resources are different based on where the school is located.
Yes.
Schools are different based on what's the postal code, right?
Yes. Yes.
That sort of segregation, that it's public funded school, but it's not only that the schools are under resourced, but also they are segregated school, public school system.
Yes.
Uh, and then, of course, you have colleges like in Upper College Canada, the elite of the elites, how they're being trained and in all of that. Um, when I personally have read the history of the contribution of our survival in North America, the contribution of black communities, indigenous communities, Puerto Rican communities, I personally have wept to understand, oh my God, this is the contribution. Bengali men have made it to North America as early as 1880. There's a
Yeah.
wonderful book, it's called Bengali Harlem,
Mhm.
that shows that in at that time, these Bengali men were, they jumped ship, because they were in the British ship as an indentured labor, so they were criminalized by both American Empire and by the British Empire. The
Yes.
lives of these men were even possible because of this radical act of solidarity,
Mm.
when these communities have extended their support to these. But fast forward, 2000, when I came to Canada, I was baffled by my own depth of ignorance. That how little I knew about the oppression of indigenous communities, and
Mhm.
how little I knew that I am the direct beneficiary of 500 years of resistance of Black and indigenous community.
Mhm.
But in comparison to that, I personally, as a Bangladeshi immigrant living in Toronto, I'm not really happy to the kind of solidarity that I see. I
Yeah.
want to see more, strong solidarity. Have a richer conversation,
Mhm.
with each other. Your years of experience working with communities, years of experience working with different communities, what could we do better to build that kind of informed, strong solidarity so that we can understand, what is at stake and why that solidarity is important?
So again, another fantastic question, and I'm always going backwards because some of the things that you were saying are so important. I just wanted to start with gratitude for something that you just said about the English language. You said when you're teaching, you teach that English is powerful. You didn't say that English is most important. The system wants
Mhm.
us to believe that that English is most important. They want it to
Yes.
be a hierarchy. But what
Mhm.
you're doing is you're saying, no, here's a tool,
Mhm.
right? And
Yeah.
right now, this
Mhm.
tool called English is going to let
Mhm.
you navigate the systems in a different
Mhm.
way, right?
Mhm.
So I
Mhm.
just wanted to say those are the kinds of things that you think that we have to do these major mind blowing actions to make
Mhm.
change, but you're
Mhm.
making change just by noting that it's about power and privilege,
Mhm.
not about God given importance,
Mhm. Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
he
Yeah.
wants us to believe that all of
Mhm.
these things are God given importance and that we should
Yeah.
believe in this particular God too, right?
Mhm. Yeah. Absolutely.
So just
Absolutely.
say, those are some
Thank you very much.
right.
Thank you.
So thank you for
Mhm.
that. I'm definitely going to get that book too. So thank you for
Mhm.
also. I love to read, so this is so important. But part of why I love to read these stories is because the system also doesn't want us to see how their resistance against racialized communities of all kinds
Mhm.
um, has actually been, it's like they're using the same method, but they need to keep us separate so that we can't talk to each other and figure out what they're doing,
Mhm. Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
when you think about the ways that we've oppressed various racialized communities over the years in this space,
Mhm.
um, They don't want us to learn about what's happened with Indigenous communities, because then we'll find out that a lot of Indigenous communities worked side by side with Black communities. And in fact, their histories are intertwined. So
Mhm.
if they have us talking to each other, that could be very problematic. I was actually
Mhm.
speaking to a woman, Lori Campbell, here. She's an excellent, excellent educator in town, a Two-Spirit Indigenous woman who works at the University of Waterloo
Mhm.
at with their Indigenous Student Center there. I think she's the director there. Anyway,
Mhm. Mhm.
Lori was talking to me one day, and she's like, I just found out that my auntie used to do work with, like, there's all these pieces of literature about them with the Black Panthers.
Hmm.
Well, nobody wants us
Wow.
to know that. Nobody wants us to know that that's the power, like, that's the power of the movement.
Mhm.
And so when I think about authentic solidarity movements, it's
Mhm.
those moments when we can literally visit with each other, sit with each
Mhm.
other, and share those stories.
Mhm.
Because when I am fighting as Laura May in 2020 during a pandemic,
Mhm.
and I'm fighting to have the system believe that addressing anti-Black racism is important, it's
Mhm.
a lonely endeavor. And
Yes,
you feel
absolutely.
the system wants you to think that you're just starting this conversation. Hence
Mhm.
why the political response is always, well, we'll do a study about it,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
But when we talk to each other, we
Mhm.
learn about older studies and
Mhm.
older relationships. And that strengthens our connection to our ancestry and our history.
Mhm.
And then all of a sudden, things become even more meaningful. And the solidarity isn't something new that we have to create, but it's like something old, like a history of ours that we just have to reconnect to. It's a
Mhm.
reconnection. And
Mhm.
that to me is, your language was radical acts of solidarity, which I
Yeah.
love.
Yeah.
And that's like, when, isn't it Bell Hooks that talks about radical acts of love?
Yeah. That's right. That helps.
Right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
that same kind of, that's what I think about. That's the love.
Mhm.
That's
Mhm.
loving ourselves in all of the ways that we've gotten here and been
Mhm.
here and are navigating things,
Mhm.
and loving ourselves so much that we won't allow the system to not allow us to have that love.
Mhm.
And in
Mhm.
that love is the solidarity and the storytelling and the
Mhm.
reconnecting and the real listening.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
when I agree, there are a lot of moments where um, we're seeing solidarity movements with folks that don't necessarily know that history, but part of that is par for the course, because the history is not being taught to us
Yeah.
purposefully. It's not being taught
Yeah.
to us.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, but we can't deny the fact that in 2020,
Mhm.
Black Lives Matter solidarity movement started up, like in June, for instance, that began all over the place,
Mhm.
um, have brought together large numbers of people that are saying to politicians, do better. Do
Mhm.
I want you to center
Mhm.
the realities for Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks. And I
Mhm.
want you to prioritize them, because if you
Mhm.
prioritize their needs and ensure their quality of life here,
Mhm.
everyone else also benefits.
Yeah,
And so
absolutely.
there's a shifting of the way
Mhm.
that people are thinking about things. And I think that that's super powerful. So I am one to always, I'm an eternal optimist.
Mhm.
Yes, we will have sort of superficial solidarity actions,
Mhm.
but we also have come into a place where we've got a Black caucus, where
Mhm.
there's, that's the first time in history that enough Black people have been
Mhm.
elected in a single party
Mhm.
to form a caucus.
Yeah,
Like, it's
absolutely.
wild to think that it took
Mhm.
until 2018, but
Yeah.
the reality is now there's an eye to addressing anti-Black racism in a particular way. And
Mhm.
the one of the pieces of us doing that work is to do it in solidarity with.
Mhm.
So sometimes the Black Caucus is providing support to our Indigenous caucus members who are
Mhm.
fighting for things that, we're talking about issues around access to this digital landscape, or this digital space.
Mhm.
And we've got Indigenous communities that my colleagues are fighting to get clean drinking water.
Mhm.
Like, how can we talk about the gentrification of digital spaces if
Mhm.
we don't talk about the fact that some folks don't even have clean drinking water?
Mhm.
Like, that's
Mhm.
what we're working with,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so
Absolutely.
how do we get them to be able to access? Because once we start doing that, that's the big change work that shifts
Mhm.
things. And again, everybody else ends up being okay too.
Yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned about Black Panther, and that one of the things that really moved me. So I didn't know about Black Panther. I didn't know about um, the 60s movement, and I mean a lot of those things. Basically, how the NAACP. None of these before actually I came to Canada, and that was possible because I had mentor who are Black scholars. I had professors who were indigenous.
Yeah.
So, and I personally feel like I was so privileged and lucky to study in a bubble that I had the opportunity of engaging with these critical scholars. So after the brutal murder of George Floyd, we had a conversation with two anthropology professor, Bangladeshi anthropology professor, one from New York University and one from Bangladesh, that why Black Lives Matter, we need to talk about this, it's incredibly important for us. Um, and at one point of the conversation, we're remembering that, let's remember, what did Malcolm X do, for the, rights of Muslims, what was, his solidarity, we wanted to remember that Muhammad Ali, he denied to go to fight in Vietnam War, even, he was risking to be jailed. So, this kind of brave act. So, whether it is oppression in Palestine and how they're showing global solidarity. One of the central reasons why this Social Justice Action Research Alliance exists is to have this global conversation. Because when a garment factory collapses in Bangladesh that claims lives, thousands of factory workers' lives, because they're producing clothes for the Canadian factory, it is connected. We are interconnected. We are connected in a global capitalistic, patriarchal, system, a racist system that we cannot, get out of it. Um, Speaking of Black Caucus, if I may, that right after the election of Barack Obama in America, there was one thing. Oh, we are living in a post-racial society. Racism is gone,
Yeah.
and all of that.
All done.
And all done.
All done.
And there we go. You have brilliant book like Racist Without Racism,
Yep.
Colorblind Racism, right? Um, it is, and we as immigrant communities, we buy. I'm talking about purely about Bangladeshi community and me as a Bangladeshi immigrant in Canada, is we buy into this model minority myth. We want to keep our eyes on the lane, don't want to challenge the white man and rock the boat. But a lot of the times we fail to understand that buying into the model minority myth is actually predicated upon racism. Is that, well, you guys don't rock the boat, but those are the troublemakers, and that can be done. How do you speak to people from different ethnic, racial background to actually expose and deconstruct the model minority myth? Is that the rights that the Black and indigenous folks are struggling for on the streets, that is inextricably connected to our rights as well? How do you deconstruct it? How do you break it down?
So oftentimes I start off with one of my favorite books, which is The Racial Contract, by Charles W. Mills. And
Okay, I
so
haven't.
this idea in the racial contract is there's a social contract that a lot of people know about. It's Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his whole idea of this social contract. And we decide as people and communities, we're going to live together, and here are going to be some of our social norms to help us all feel safe and secure and have access to what we need to survive. And Mills says that underneath that contract is a racial contract. And the racial contract is one that nobody talks about. But the idea is you have to look a particular way or act in a particular way to access that racial bubble that allows you to actually thrive, right? And to access success, etc. But we don't talk about it. So we run around thinking that it's just a social contract. And what I love about his work is that he toys with this idea that no matter the actual color of your skin, because race is a fiction anyway, it's a story that people in power told in order to be able to win the fight and stay in positions of power. So anybody, despite the color of your skin or your background, can step into whiteness. And whiteness is that position of power and privilege, right? But if you happen to mess up and you don't look like the stereotypical person, you can get booted out of it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so
Absolutely.
for me, it's always to shift our focus into when we talk about race and racism, we're not talking about simply the color of your skin and the solution is we just love different kinds of people, which is how the state has tried to present a solution, multicultural acts and even Black History Month. Black History Month. What is that? We're going to sell. I have started to tell people that I don't need the month to celebrate myself. I celebrate myself every day, every day. What I need is that month to be an educational forum, right? Where we start to center those voices because until the whole system changes, at least I can do that work in that month, right?
Yeah. That's right.
But at the end of the day, I think it's really important for us to understand that the real discussion isn't about the color of your skin. And if you don't know what the root of the discussion is, you can't come up with a solution. It's literally a discussion about power. That's really what we're talking about. We're
Yep.
talking about social power. And we're talking about even this notion of the model minority. Are you getting the power that you think you're meant to get? Because you're not. Usually, if the fact that you are trying to act in a particular way indicates that you know that somebody does not think that you are the same as them, right? That
That's
they
right.
think
That's
less
right.
of you. So you're already buying into the system.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's really important for us to sort of step back and say, okay, this is about power and privilege. My qualifications don't do the same thing as your qualifications. And there's real systemic things that can happen to change so that more
Yeah.
people have access.
Mm-hmm.
And the
Yeah.
other last little thing, it's kind of an aside, but it's not. But as you were speaking about the Panthers, like there's a history of the Black Panthers here that we often don't talk about. There's also a history of other really strong, politically savvy communities that have done things in this space that we don't talk about simply so that we can go back to this idea that all of those racial politics stuff, they happened across the border, right? They happened in the US. We didn't have that kind of racial unrest. And so that makes us not remember that there were groups like um, the Black Action Defense Committee, the Bad C. They're the ones who actually started to fight for the SIU. They were fighting against police brutality here, right? And they were
Yeah.
doing so. I believe that was in the 60s as well. That they were having that fight right here, right? And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
that history is our history. And so I always find it fascinating because even with all of the background that I have and all of the education that I've done, we've done a really good job as Canadians to hide racial unrest, right?
Yeah.
Nobody learns about what's happening in Nova Scotia and about the history of Black folks there. The first um, Black person from Africa to come to this soil, some say it's 1608, um, and that he was a translator for whoever the person is that was coming here, right? They have this big history here, but we don't learn about it. So I'm still learning about these things. But then it goes back to how do you do that? It's that radical relationship building. We build relationships and we start to talk to each other and we start to learn these new histories and then go out and we do the work and learn about it, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Exactly.
so I think everybody should read The Racial Contract.
Yeah. Oh my
One of
God.
my
I mean, I haven't read that book, and I mean, when I read my mentor, Dr. Tamari Kitosa at Brock University, he gave me a book in a Eurogu. When I read it, it feels like, I mean, I kept on getting like, constantly, and it's interesting that I had all these great conversations, not in a class setup.
no.
All this happened because, I mean, I was just thinking, like, if you just take a random, master's or PhD level, theory course in social sciences, and you read the reading list, just read the last name.
Mhm.
And it's fascinating, and I often contest this, with my professors. I'm not sure that makes me very popular. And when you were talking about your experience, um, it reminded me of things that I wouldn't want to bring it here, but the space, the academic space, can be very brutal and violent,
Oh yeah.
but we don't want to talk about it. We don't
No,
want to
and
talk.
you know what? That
Mhm.
that academic space, our educational spaces, we are starting now to talk about that rather frequently, I would argue. It's like there's
Mhm.
always these ebbs and flows in any kind of racial equity movements, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
But currently, there are a lot of parents and community members who are talking about the need to address anti-Black racism in schools,
Mhm.
and they're talking from K to 12, and more reports coming out and showing that when a young Black boy, so it's also a mix, right? The intersections of gender and race. A young Black boy just being 5 will be disciplined far more heavily than a young white boy being 5. You assume the young white boy is just being a kid, right? But as
Mhm.
soon as you add race to the mix, you're like, oh, there's like intentionality to be horrid, right?
Mhm.
And then
Yeah.
we're going to stop it, and you justify that discipline because you think you're helping this little kid.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
we know that this is happening, and we know that I'm going to kind of bring it back to the last question. What
Mhm.
what I think we don't want to actually say out loud is that for racial hierarchies, when we think about power, it actually doesn't matter if you identify as brown or Black or indigenous or mixed. The minute that you are not white, that's
Yeah.
where issues start.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
we often spend all this time trying to self-identify in all of these unique ways, as though that's
Mhm.
going to bring us into the space of whiteness more easily. And
Mhm.
I'm here to tell you it does not matter.
Mhm.
It
Yeah.
literally does not matter.
Yeah.
These systems are structured on
Mhm.
a particular understanding of what power looks like, and in
Mhm.
when you add that layer of race, it's the
Mhm.
space of whiteness.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
it's not
Yeah.
white people.
Mhm.
Like, that's the other piece, because we also like I'm Jamaican.
Mhm.
So in Jamaica, there are a lot of white Jamaicans who self-identify as Black.
Mhm.
They are white in
Mhm.
terms of what in Canada you would consider to be race based on what I see.
Mhm.
But for them,
Mhm.
racial designations are political. They're the way that you think about the world. They're not about the
Mhm.
color of your skin.
Mhm.
And so as Jamaicans, they are Black,
Yeah. Mhm.
and they will fight you if
Mhm.
you try to challenge them.
um,
They will fight.
I, yeah, I think there is some things that we can talk about it. Um, I may identify as Black, being white, but the world is not so threatening and risky for me when I have a skin that is white. So that is something. I'm a parent. I have a son whose name is unmistakably Muslim, and when I think about that, my son, when he'll be coming to Canada. So an incident happened last year. An Indian single mother came to Canada, and she had a 12-year-old son who was going to school, and he was getting regularly bullied, and he came to home, and he told his mother that I'm being bullied, and I don't want to go to school, but she sent her to school anyway, and she admitted her to martial art training or something,
Mhm.
and then. Um, he was blamed to be stealing gaming console in the classroom, and very typical, very that from the white kids, and into that's last year, by the way. That's very recent. That kid jumped from the 24th floor and committed suicide. He left a note saying that I'm so sorry, I've been a disappointment to you. Um, and then in the interview, I was watching that, and I had a wonderful conversation with two women, Bangladeshi women. One is in Ireland, the other one is in Canada, and she's also one has finished a PhD as an anthropology professor, and the other is doing her PhD at York University. We're discussing about single parenthood. We're discussing the experiences of being a single mother, an immigrant mother, in
Mhm.
countries like Canada, in white countries. I think you have mentioned that it's also the ability of code switching.
Yeah.
I have had personal I have experienced kind of racism that I've experienced. I don't think if I didn't have a heightened political consciousness I would be able to recognize that.
Yeah.
Working for software companies, I have talked to clients, high-end clients, right, customers, And when they would, pick that from the way I speak, my idiosyncratic ways of speaking English, they would recognize that I'm not from. I wasn't born and raised in Canada. Pick on me. I remember one woman distinctly telling me that I don't think you are even speaking English. And I was thinking that I've completed 3 master's degree and all of them in English.
Yeah.
And I have studied all my life in, and that's like, again, when I first came to Canada, I would constantly, like you, when you were saying, is that when your professor said you are not a EFT material and how you believed it, I
Hmm.
mean, the level of self-doubt I have gone through,
Yep.
and the level of, James Baldwin, the, Malcolm X reading, Edward Du Bois, Franz Fanon, that I needed,
Yeah.
to understand that how that layer actually lies.
Yeah.
Um, it's fascinating that how do and when you were talking about, black kids as young as 5 years old, I'm not going to mention that name. I had one opportunity of going to a school with a friend of mine who was picking his son from school, and a kid as young as 5, his teacher came, and I was standing. She had no idea that I have, trainings in sociology, right? So, saying, your son does not take responsibility for his action. He needs to build accountability. And I'm standing there, and I'm feeling like, am I hearing this right? Like,
Yeah.
am I hearing this right? And subsequently, I wanted to have a conversation with him. And that boy, 5-year-old boy, can you imagine? So he got out of the school and he was refusing to wear a winter jacket in the midst of like snowing. Imagine the humiliation that he was dealing with. And then I wanted to have a conversation with him, and I have talked about this with Dolly as well. Is that we want to have a conversation with immigrant parents that, what kind of racism their kids go through. And I'm also requesting, urging you, pleading you, is that from your party, if something can be done in order to, have rich, curated conversation to navigate the academia. It's not apolitical; it's very political.
It is
Um,
the most political space
yeah,
outside of the political space that I'm in now,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. I had one, Facebook group conversation where I saw that a mother, helpless mother, has posted that my daughter has come back to school, come back, from school to home, from come back home, and I see a bruise on her head, like a bump. What should I do? And I'll tell you, I was reading the comments of the community members, and
Mhm.
most of us, we said, oh, it happens, don't take it seriously. It's. But I was thinking that what kind of conversation we need to have to, have this, addressed. Tell us, please, your view about it, and what are the things that, in a way forward, to have a richer conversation with particularly immigrant parents who don't know, is,
Yeah.
how do you deal with it, right?
So I have a couple thoughts about this as well. So one is a lot of racialized community members come from spaces that hold educators up on a pedestal, right? Like the educational space is the space that can potentially get you out of poverty, can help the family to grow, can bring you into a space of intergenerational wealth. Like education is a social mover, right? But then you come here and it's that same, that's how we are seeing the teachers, but we're not getting the same kind of respect in return, and the relationship isn't the same between the educators here and our kids. And the system has been set up differently in ways that allow these pathways to ensure that racialized young people don't succeed. That they, in, we talk about high dropout rates. The fact that the system even called it dropping out as though it was your fault that you chose to drop out as opposed to being pushed out of the educational system, is already showing you where the flaws are, right? So I'll stick a pin in that and I'll tell you this story. My mom got here, my parents got here from Jamaica in the 60s. I'm the youngest of 4 kids. All 4 of the kids have gone, we went to the same elementary, middle, and high school, as many immigrant families, like you sort of settle and you decide, I'm going to create some roots, right? You're going to try to the best of your ability to create some roots. So born and raised in Scarborough, Ontario. My mom was told by my uncle, who happened to also be in politics, that my uncle is Alvin Curling. So he was the first Black elected Speaker of the House. That's a whole other story. And he was a Liberal. And so my, yeah,
Wow.
I know, that's a whole other story. But my uncle told my parents, this school system is not the same system as in Jamaica. The teachers don't have the same beliefs about the kids and their success here as in Jamaica. And you cannot allow them to put your kids into basic, because back then it was either basic or academic streams. They will rationalize why that your child should be in basic, and they will justify it, but you have to fight and get them into academic, so right? So my mom watched my eldest brother, who's now an engineer. He actually works at the University of Toronto, and he came from Jamaica. Jamaica, the first language is English, and they wanted to put him into ESL, right?
Wow.
And
Wow.
I speak English, better English than you, right? But he's Black, so they assume that in Jamaica they don't speak. I don't know what they thought he spoke, right? And any event, Mummy decided this is not going to happen. And like many, many immigrant families, she had 3 or 4 jobs, right? Part-time jobs cobbled together, because no matter what she was doing before, she worked in the banking industry in Jamaica, but coming here, they made her start from the beginning. So she's having to navigate racism within the employment system here, while
Yep.
trying to navigate racism within the education system, and set her kids up for success, because why else did you come here? She started to volunteer at the school. And my mom volunteered at the lunchroom program and spent the time between, like, she would get there early and she would be at the roundabout where most of the parents would drop off their kids.
Hmm.
She would talk to the racialized parents, and she
Oh,
would
wow.
tell them the advice that Uncle Alvin gave to her, and tell them the experiences that she had. And again, it's relationship building. She would tell them, you can't trust the system. And then they would come to her and say, this is what's happening with my kid. And she, no, you can't let it happen. If it means that you have to take the time to speak to your child about doing extra homework to get through the math curriculum, or get a tutor or whatever, you do whatever, but that kid stays in the academic stream, because even getting a 50 in the academic stream keeps university and college a possibility, right? Well, university a possibility. Whereas going through the basic program, that's closed, right? That's what she did. She literally spoke to people nonstop. And when I graduated from that school, even when I was in high school, my mom was still volunteering as a lunchroom supervisor there to talk to
Wow.
families.
Wow. That runs in the blood.
You got to do what you got to do. The system's not changing, so then we create other systems to ensure that we protect each other and build community, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And
absolutely,
then over
absolutely.
time, because they saw this happening, then some of that starts to shift, right? Like within the system. But then the ultimate hope is that you get folks um, like the Black Caucus into positions of power, so that we can start pushing back. So one of the other things, like we tabled a motion asking for the Minister of Education to create a transparent anti-racism plan for education. One that actually took into account all of the different ways that the system uh, keeps Black, Brown, Indigenous folks out of those positions of privilege. And to name the kinds of racism, like anti-Semitism appears differently than Islamophobia, than anti-Black racism, than anti-Indigenous racism. They don't show up in the same ways. And so we've got to be clear about that. And then you develop your solutions and structures based on that. Most people think that the only way to combat racism in schools is through the curriculum. That's an important piece, but it's not the only piece. Like a lot of my experiences of anti-Black racism were on the playground,
Okay.
right? They were the ways that teachers said that you should or shouldn't be in this space. I hear from young people today, they're playing or whatever, they're joking around, they're listening to music in high school, and they're laughing too loud and they're being policed. And a group of white students doing the same thing are just being told to just quiet down. Whereas the other students are being told, you can't stand here anymore, right? Like, and we're gonna send you to the principal's office. And there's documented examples of this,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
then you add the layer of, and we've got police in high schools here. Why do
Yeah.
we have police in high schools? Why would we do that? Why would
Yeah.
you scare people into submission unless you wanted to scare people into submission,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
And I don't think that that's the way that we build confidence and show love and care and support for young people that are going to be tomorrow's leaders. We've got
Yeah.
to do that literally loving them. And you don't do it by triggering in them this kind of fear that they are bad.
Yeah.
And then that's where a lot of what you were talking about is what I have been taught is the internalized racism,
Yes.
right? And so
Yes.
you internalize these ideas about what you can and can't achieve, who you are, where you should be, what you can study, what you can't study. You rationalize that, you deny yourself opportunities,
Yeah.
and then the system says, I gave you every option. And then you say, see, the problem is me.
Yeah.
I'm telling to all of the young people that are out there that are listening to this and to all of their parents, the problem is not you, the problem is the system.
System.
The problem is the system. The system does not, the system is denying you access to the love and the care and support that you need. It is
Yeah.
the system, it is not you. And so if
Yeah.
there is somebody that you know that you can reach out to, and I tell people, reach out to my office, I will find people for you to talk to. But it is the problem is in the system. And before I pass it back to you, I just want to acknowledge that young person who died by suicide and whose family now and friends are traumatized because of that. Even the bullies are going to be traumatized because of that, right? Because everybody is going to be wondering about what they did. The teachers who didn't say anything when they witnessed said bullying, or the principals who didn't stand up, or the other kids that were witnessing this and were quiet. That's the reason why right now we talk about silence being violence.
Yes.
It's the inaction that does something very simple would have indicated to somebody, to this young person, that they did matter, right? And what
Yeah.
I find fascinating in education is that we'll talk about bullying
Mhm.
and we'll do all sorts of things. Like I've seen benches erected where you can have like an anti-bullying bench, and teachers in schools here. There's anti-bullying curriculum, and they have to teach you about this. But as soon as it's racial bullying, bullying based on race, it's like they forgot the skills.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
forgot that they could teach about that. They forgot that they weren't allowed to do that. All of a sudden, there's silence, and that's where the violence is. That's epistemic violence.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I was working in the areas of diversity and inclusion in tech companies, and it's interesting that how and that I mean, I want to before I switch gear into a technology conversation that is incredibly important that we need to talk about it, is that where diversity is often conflated or with white women's escalation to
And
power and privileges and etc. I've done some research. Um, in 2018, a study that has been continuously longitudinally being done. University of Toronto and University of Ryerson sent about 13,000 resumes, identical resumes, just changing the name. When you have a candidate with a European sounding, white sounding name, and you have candidates with a black name, South Asian name, and all of their name, 38% people did not get a phone call back. Just this is 38%, and this is 2018. I'm not talking about 60s, right? Um, an experiment that has been continued that started first in the University of Howard University, that black doll and white doll
Yeah.
experiment. That when kids as young as 3 recognize, the racism and internalized racism, and when I read the study, what broke my heart, that when the black children pick up a white
Right.
doll, identifying that to be a good doll, not to be able to say why, but saying that, oh, it is, it is it reminded me vividly about Ruby Bridges, is
Yeah.
that, what she must have felt when she was going to school, and I get goosebumps every time I think about her. Is I think about, there's I love that book, The White Rage,
Yeah.
by Carol Anderson. Is that, understanding that why police had to shoot 42 rounds on Amadou. You know, it wasn't like just few days back. An unarmed black man was shot 7 times on the back, and you have a white 18-year-old, 17-year-old, with a gun, but having that. I often resort to understand this. I borrow from Ruth Wilson in her book Golden Gulag, is that capitalism is not a thing, it is a kind of relationship. It extracts profit based on inequality, based on hierarchy, and racism enshrines that inequality better than anything.
Yeah.
So, and she coined the term racial capitalism. It's not just capitalism,
It's
it's
racial.
racial capitalism, right? Um, Now, let's switch gear in conversation, that we live in a time of exponential technology, and we live in a time of exponential time. What would take place in 100 years, let's say from first to second industrial revolution, now it happens in a matter of 2 to 3 years because of exponential technologies like big data, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and so on. Um, there have been, ton of research, and even in Canada, I mean, I can quote one particular researcher from University of Guelph, Dr. Small. She is looking into a black, professor looking into digital politics. Is that, how the data is being leveraged to actually do politics.
Yeah.
We all know about Cambridge Analytica, what happened in Brexit, what happened in. I had the opportunity of asking this question to our Toronto mayor in a tech conference. Is that what do you think about public data? That what if the external adversary, used that public data to automate hate?
Mhm.
Let's not forget about Faith Goldie. She came third in mayoral competition.
Yeah.
Um, and again, as I was telling you, that a parental anxiety, having a son with an unmistakable Muslim name and brown skin, right? Um, what are the things that you have been hearing about, how these technologies are being used to, hide racism behind so-called machine neutrality, you know, and in your caucus, in conversation, critical conversation, some of the things that is coming to your attention, and then I'll ask you some subsequent questions about digital racism.
So, some people don't necessarily know this about me, but when I was doing my degrees in education, I my supervisor focused on technology and gender issues in particular. And so a lot of my research at the time and like projects I was a part of were actually about technology in the world. And one of the I at one point when I was teaching in Teachers College, actually at the University of Prince Edward Island, um, I was teaching technology integration in the curriculum with these education students. And all sorts of research, people thought the history of education, technology was this great neutralizer. And I would start off from that space and explain, like, no, 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 it's not a thing. But in order for me to do that, I remember one of the first assignments that the students did was to just list the technology that they know. Like, what technology do you know about? You don't have to know how to use it, just what do you know about? And, of course, they're going to say computers and video game consoles and all of this kind of stuff. And I would just pick up my pen because my pen or a pencil was technology. And that technology was used to write books
Mhm.
that say that I,
Mhm.
because of the color of my skin, am lesser than you because of the color of your skin. That's
Yep.
technology,
Mm-hmm.
right? And there's a person behind the technology that holds all of those social norms, that's
Mm-hmm.
making decisions about how the technology is to be used,
Mm-hmm.
when it is to be used, what it's supposed to do, what data you can see, and what data the person that's actually creating it can see,
Mm-hmm.
right? Who's going to get to know that? All of that. Those are all
Mm-hmm.
social things that are going to
Mm-hmm.
definitely be shaped by our understanding of race and racism, our desire to be a an anti-racist person or a racist person, really, right? And whether we're going to build anti-racist societies or racist societies. So skip ahead to your actual question around the technology piece. Um, I think we've always been having this discussion. We just haven't been seeing it as a technology discussion because
Mm-hmm.
we haven't labeled all of the other tools technology.
Mm-hmm.
But all of those
Yeah.
tools are tech tools.
Mm-hmm.
And then as tech has evolved, of course, all of the same inequities are embedded in there. When it
Mm-hmm.
comes to politics in particular, there's always a discussion about who the real voters are and who the other voters are, if
Mm-hmm.
they even vote. Who are the
Mm-hmm.
people that we're catering to? The people that'll go out to the polls. We'll
Mm-hmm.
talk to them, right?
Mm-hmm.
But why do we have voter suppression? Not just in the US, but we have it here too, right? Voter suppression is based on not believing that those folks matter. So you cater towards certain people. Then you realize that you've got too many of those other people. And so you've got to do things to not let them get to the polls.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That is my
Exactly.
overview
Mm-hmm.
of voter suppression.
Mm-hmm.
Technology can do that,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
So there was an election a few some years back. I think
Mm-hmm.
I was in PEI at the time, so I want to say it was like 2010-ish, something around there. I just remember there were
Mm-hmm.
school phone calls that were going out to certain communities, mostly racialized communities, from what I gather, where they were saying that your polling station had changed,
Yeah.
but the polling station hadn't changed.
Mm-hmm.
And so there we go, voter suppression, right?
Mm-hmm.
All of a sudden, these spaces that we think that we're supposed to go to have the democratic right to choose who our leadership
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
is being toyed with. That's
Mm-hmm.
technology, and that was a phone call.
Yeah.
Now you
Yeah.
skip ahead to, again, I don't know how we have the discussion without talking about the fact that this is happening during a pandemic when
Mm-hmm.
we've had to lock ourselves in our homes and
Mm-hmm.
rely on technology to continue to work in the way that the system wants us to work.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if you happen to be in a field where that switch isn't possible, which a lot of
Mm-hmm.
racialized people are in, you
Yep.
potentially are dealing with a loss of income at this time, maybe no job at all, trying to
Mm-hmm.
figure out how to switch into a new field during a pandemic. None of that is
Mm-hmm.
good, right?
Yep.
Plus
Yep.
the other things like, um, no rent freezes until recently. They're announcing it now, and all of this kind of stuff. So all of these other pressures.
Mm-hmm.
Um, our reliance on technology is forcing us to have to stare right in the face
Mm-hmm.
what those analytic realities are behind all of the technology that we're using.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Mm-hmm.
been there all along, but I think the urgency for us to better understand how it perpetuates or resists racism is hugely important now. There's
Mm-hmm.
been a lot of talk, for instance, about the need to collect race-based data. Like we've
Mm-hmm.
fought to collect race-based data because our political system says if you don't have proof of what it is that the investment that you're fighting for, we will not invest. And
Mm-hmm.
so people are on both sides of this, all the sides of this argument, saying we need to collect this data, which is a technological thing that we're going to have to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
To collect the data and house the data, et cetera. And then people that do anti-racism work with technology that
Mm-hmm.
talk about racism in the AI, the field of AI, artificial intelligence, are saying, okay, but who's collecting what? Who's
Mm-hmm.
holding on to it? What are they
Mm-hmm.
doing with it? What are the parameters? Where's the privacy stuff?
Mm-hmm.
And then you have like an example of the Solicitor General during the pandemic saying, here's a database of all sorts of health data that the police are allowed to access,
Mm-hmm.
right? And all these stats came out, and certain areas were accessing that database for like in huge numbers,
Mm-hmm.
and none of us know why,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
So
Mm-hmm.
are there concerns? Oh, yeah. So many
Mm-hmm.
concerns. is there a need for us to be honest about like where we are evolving as a people during this pandemic? Yes.
Hmm. Hmm.
Can we do that and have an anti-racist lens?
Hmm.
Yes, but only if you have the right people in positions of power that are making decisions about this that
Hmm.
actually have an anti-racist lens.
Yeah, yeah. Doesn't Canada for the first time have a minister for digital government?
So on the provincial, no,
Federal.
federally,
Yeah.
I will have to look it up and see.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I did, and this is the first time for the first time,
I've never
and
heard of such a thing. Sure. Now I want to Google it.
yeah, we have for the first time a federal minister for digital government. So I'm going to take us to a bit of a scary land, but it's a very reality. I think I can't remember who said it, but it's a very well used quote that you know uh, the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed.
Yep.
And I think it's Arthur C. Clarke who said that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So what we are seeing right now is magic happening all around us. I'll give you
Mhm.
some examples, right? Okay. Think about the nature of some of the latest social movement, like whether it is Occupy Wall Street, whether it is Idle No More, whether it is Black Lives Matter. I had the opportunity of filming an entire conference about the social movements in Canada. Basically, scholars from all over the world came. How the movements took place in Middle East. The Arab Spring. What are the how this organization actually happened. How did it happen in Turkey? One commonality, and at that time I was still a graduate student. I didn't work in tech companies. I had no idea the capacity of artificial intelligence and its capacity of surveillance and classifying and all of that. A book came out that I personally beg people to read it if we were to live in the world that came out last year, 2019. It's called the Surveillance Capitalism by
Mm.
Sushana Zuboff. Um, in that surveillance capitalism, Professor Zuboff, what she argues is that it's not the digital that is the problem. It is the logic that is governing the
Yes.
digital.
Yes.
So each and every single human interaction is a commodity for extracting profit, and which is why that it made me so impassionate about it. And my entire PhD is about how to use exponential technologies to make marginalized communities, sustainable, build sustainable marginalized community. I'll give you one example. Let's say in Hamilton or in your riding, let's say there is a small coffee shop run by let's say a black single mother, right? She does not have the tools to amplify her voice. She does not have, let's say, somebody is going in that neighborhood and they don't know if there is a coffee shop around. Just whip out their phone and okay, I want to see a coffee shop. If that single mother does not have the digital tools to exist on the digital space, she doesn't even exist. Now, if I borrow from Baudrillard, like simulation and simulacra, is that there was a time when the representation came later before the reality. And in that book, when it was turned, now it is the representation, it is the virtual that is more important than the real. We are
Mhm.
living in a time where you have pathological liars like Donald Trump, when who comes on saying lies, and they are believed by millions of people who don't have the literacy to actually understand this digital space. We are living at a time where seeing is no longer believing. Hearing is no longer believing. It is possible, and this is going to be scary, it is possible for somebody to actually build a simple program where Dr. Laura May Lindo is saying the most horrible, despicable thing with deepfake,
Mhm.
with artificial intelligence. So if this conversation, how many black community members or indigenous community members or immigrant community members, they do know that this digital forensics, to understand that what you see and what you hear is no longer believable. you
Mhm.
know, uh, Elon Musk came 3 weeks ago with a link that can actually read your neural, spike in real time. Talk about Aldous Huxley. It's happening right now, right here, right? So in a world like this, we cannot. I mean, I think schools, particularly in the resource poor communities, schools are way behind bringing this curriculum in the school. But I have seen high officials, CEOs or ranking high people in the tech communities, their kids come to the tech scenes at age like 11, 12, 13, and they're having privy to technology that is making or breaking the world. So this is a scary scenario, but it's here. What's your take on that? How do we go forward from here?
So I tend to see the world. This might sound a little weird, but here we are. I tend to see the world like I see music. Okay, so I'm a musician, and some people think that music is new. Like somebody comes out with like a new whatever. It's all recycled. You've got 12 notes. This is all you've got. You keep playing with them, right? And so sometimes you're taking bits and pieces of the old stuff and putting it into something in a novel way, but that creation is not new. And so I tell you that because when I think about this, I can't help, like you talked about 1984, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
Like 1984, that this stuff was happening there. If somebody could imagine it to write 1984, then all of the tools are actually the same tools at base.
Hmm. Hmm.
I like this. I'm going to go read this surveillance capitalism.
Yep.
So the
Yeah.
fact that it's the logic, because
Hmm.
literally it's the same kinds of thinking around it. What
Hmm.
it makes me think is
Hmm.
that there is an urgent need to teach young people about the systems around them, not about curriculum and disciplines, but about systems and how they are structured, how our society is structured. You can teach math and science and geography and all that through there, but ultimately the focus has to be on understanding the systems and teaching that. Because if we understood how the systems were structured, then we would literally be teaching the logic behind the technology that you're talking about,
Hmm.
right? And in
Hmm.
teaching that logic, you're giving us a possibility to rethink why we're doing what we're doing.
Hmm. Hmm.
And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
that is where my brain goes. It is
Hmm.
a scary place because in order for us to do that, we have to remember that there's like centuries of folks that didn't get that education about the system that are trying to use these systems to do horrible, horrible things.
Hmm.
But I refuse to allow them to win by taking my spirit and my optimism. They won't.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
They
Absolutely.
will. And so when I think about the kinds of ways that we can change, like we have digital literacy courses, because remember when computers, I'm older, so computers were first brought into the schools, and then
Hmm.
then they invented this thing, Wikipedia, and then all of a sudden all the kids are using Wikipedia as like knowledge about whatever, and they didn't know that it's like regular people just changing it up, right?
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
And so they had to teach these
Hmm.
skills. I feel like we need to address the fact that it's not just understanding the system as though that system is neutral, but
Hmm.
it's understanding that none of these systems are actually neutral. That to me is
Yeah.
the systems teaching that has to happen.
Yeah. Some of the things, in terms of like, what's a little different. You've given a beautiful example that in the 12 notes of music. Um, it just the scale of it. Let's say if I give a naive example, like let's say my grandfather had, let's say 80% understanding of my father's life.
Hmm.
My father, who has never stepped into a university campus, has not left his village. Uh, if I tell him that if money is not an issue, anything that you ask will be given to you, I doubt that he's going to say I want iPhone 12X
Yeah.
or I want an expensive car. It's in the consciousness. What's the realm of possibility? I was giving example of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. So when Elon Musk launched the product, I mean, I have worked in tech companies where in real time, within a matter of seconds, the company could do an emotional analytics of customers, let's say 150,000 people in a matter of few seconds. That how are you feeling right now? So I'm talking about scalability, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm talking about when uh, police is already using predictive policing tools, like, what are the neighborhood where crime is likely to happen. So, oh, it's the machine, it's not the humans, right?
Yeah.
So they are free from all the biases and etc. So in America, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she brought a bill, is that algorithmic accountability bill, is that algorithm, that it is bringing the bias, because these algorithms are trained on biased data. Now, the other thing is that, what I mentioned, that the map is not essentially the territory. Now, question, that we need to consider is that who is making the map?
Mm-hmm.
There was a human geographer who asked a very critical question, is that, right now, the digital footprint, I mean, you should, so Dr. Sophia Noble, she has written a book, it's called, How Google, is actually further, is perpetuating racism, facilitating racism. There was a time in our lifetime, I didn't grow up with technology. I was born in a small village. I grew up raising animals. When I came to Canada, I was like, oh my God, this is so much, like, technology is so dangerous now, so overrun by technology, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, the thing is, if you just Google that black women should and see what are the research
Oh, yeah.
results come. There was a time that we would go to a library and we would rely on books for information. But just think psychologically to what is the percentage of people who believe that when you search something on Google, the answer Google gives you is neutral and accurate,
Yes. Yep.
and we don't question.
No.
Yeah. So this is emergency. This is like almost. There's a wonderful scholar, researcher. His name is Tristan Harris. Tristan gave a testimony at the Senate in USA. In Stanford University, in '90s, they set up a lab. It's called Persuasive Technology.
Mm.
It is possible for me, like, imagine that we humans have evolved 2.5 million years, and how our brain has evolved. It is literally possible right now to hack human beings, their attention, their brain. That
Mm-hmm.
our kids, when they are hooked onto, the moment they log into computer, they're logging into trillion-dollar resources, billions of algorithms, and they don't stand a chance, because behind the screen they have army of social psychologists, neurologists,
Mm-hmm.
computer scientists. So this is a very pernicious use of technology. But this conversation doesn't happen around the dining table. When I try to talk about it, my personal experience, either people feel put off, like, scary, or
Mm-hmm.
they don't understand, or they think, oh, it's science fiction-y thing. It's not science fiction. It's
Well,
real.
I think that's part of why I always go back to we've actually been here before. I understand it's the scale of it that we are talking about right now, but if I imagine myself in the past when we were also having this kind of invasive surveillance of our beings, for that period of time, it was also on a grand scale. Like a lot of this stuff has been happening for a very long time, right? Is what I'm saying. The ways that technologies have been used to invade people's privacy has been happening for a long time. That's the reason why we have privacy laws. Yes,
Mhm,
the scale has changed because things have evolved, but the
mhm,
reality is those privacy laws were probably not sufficient to deal with the scale of the invasion of our privacy at the time that
mhm,
they were done either.
mhm,
The other piece, at least, and I am not professing to be an expert in any of these areas, but the other piece that I think is becoming more and more visible for me, especially in this role, is that there's no accountability. It's the accountability part of it in AOC's bill that I'm thinking about. It's
mhm,
the accountability part that a lot of the folks that are reaching out to me about the way that AI is
mhm,
being leveraged, who's
mhm,
getting access to our data, changes
mhm,
like quiet changes to privacy legislation in Ontario that nobody wants to talk about. All
mhm,
of those things are happening, and everybody's it's not a big deal, right? No, it's not a big deal. It is a big deal. It is a major deal because all of that is going to be used to create and rebuild society either in the same way that it has, with certain people at the bottom, certain people at the top, or that or it can change the priorities about what it is that we do and how we do it and who has access to a better quality of life.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
the piece that is like in any of the sectors or spaces where we're talking about social injustice,
Hmm.
uh, legislators often don't want to put accountability into those bills.
Hmm.
If we're talking about capitalism and
Hmm.
money making, they'll put accountability in those.
Hmm. Yeah, oh, yeah. Of
Those
course.
all accountability. Nobody
Hmm.
questions it. And what's going to be the fine, right? There's
Hmm.
got to be a fine. Law and order. But when it
Hmm.
comes to social justice, it's
Hmm.
like, why should somebody be held accountable for promoting racist technology or promoting the use of technology in a racist way?
Yeah,
And for
yeah,
racialized folks, we're like, well, I know why there should be accountability in there.
yeah,
But for
yeah.
many other people, they're like, it's okay. Those companies aren't going to use the technology in that way. We can rely on them.
Mhm.
And then I go back to, but we've been here before. No,
Yeah,
we can't
yeah.
rely on people in positions of power who have
Hmm.
never had our interest at heart to do the right thing today. They're
Hmm.
just going to today wake up and decide to care.
Yeah, yeah. I wish. I wish. I know that you will have to attend something in about 10 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah.
I hope you understand that our conversation is incomplete. We have not been able to cover so many things, and these are incredibly important conversation. Right now I'm located in Bangladesh. I'll be, flying back to Canada, in Guelph, and next month, I'm having a conversation with Noam Chomsky about, neoliberalism and climate justice issues in Bangladesh, basically what is happening. And I also, I'm planning to talk to him about, because I don't, just a week ago, Google has launched their most ambitious project to the day, is that solving climate crisis. Basically, the whole environment it has a great goal. It's just that the data governance and data accountability, all of these things have to be considered. I would really, really like us to have critical conversation around technology. It's not only my PhD research. I think if we don't take these things into consideration, it is all on the old logic. The
Hmm.
logic is the same.
Hmm.
The scale is different, and how, in terms of climate, we have about 10 years.
Hmm.
In terms of exponential technology, we have less than that.
Yeah.
And Yuval Noah Harari said in his book is that we have been talking about exploitation all along, but right now, what we are imminently going to face is not exploitation. Far worse, is irrelevance. You have already mentioned is that how black folks, people of color, indigenous people are the most disposable, people, right? So we need to have this conversation. We need to develop data literacy, digital, accountable artificial intelligence conversation with the indigenous communities, with the black communities, with the people of color communities, and that's where I call to my own South Asian friends and community members, like, we are in tech, we're
Hmm.
doing good in tech.
Hmm.
So it's about time that we put in our, what's that English saying, that put your money where your mouth is? Isn't that
Money
expression
in
in
your
English?
mouth, as they say. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So if we want solidarity, we got to have that conversation. Um, Thank you, Dr. Laura Melindo. Thank you very much for giving us this time. Please, please, please consider, looking at your schedule whenever it is convenient, that if we can go to the second episode of this conversation. And anything that you have picked up from here is that if there is anything that you could have conversation with Black Caucus, is would be incredibly important, and have this conversation that is incredibly important.
Fantastic. I will definitely be back. This has been
Yeah,
amazing.
thank you very much. Have a wonderful day for you, evening here. Bye bye.
Bye.